Imagine freezing in the dark while sitting directly on top of a billion-dollar ocean of crude oil. You are wrapped in heavy blankets inside a freezing house, staring at a monthly electric bill that costs more than a mortgage, shivering in the very state that famously fuels the rest of the American economy. When most people think of Alaska, they picture massive wealth. They picture the sprawling oil fields of Prudhoe Bay, the towering steel structure of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and a state government so rich from petroleum revenues that it literally pays its citizens an annual dividend just for living there. Alaska is the ultimate American energy fortress. But if you leave the paved highways and fly into the vast, roadless expanse of the Alaskan Bush, that illusion of energy wealth instantly shatters. You will find a terrifying, deeply ironic reality. The people living closest to the largest oil reserves on the continent are currently suffering from some of the most severe, crippling energy poverty in the developed world. Despite being an absolute titan of global energy production, rural Alaska relies almost entirely on primitive, highly expensive diesel generators just to survive the brutal winter. This is the ultimate geographic paradox. It is a story of extreme supply chains, staggering utility bills, and communities held entirely hostage by a fuel they cannot afford, yet cannot live without. Stick with me until the very end of this video, because the final, terrifying reality of the diesel death spiral, and what it is physically doing to the ground these villages are built on, will completely shatter how you look at the true cost of fossil fuels. To understand why an oil-rich state is trapped in a diesel nightmare, you first have to understand the map. In the lower 48 states, if you flip a light switch, you are drawing power from a massive, interconnected continental grid. Thousands of power plants, from nuclear to natural gas to solar, feed electricity across thousands of miles of transmission lines. If one plant goes down, the grid automatically reroutes power to keep your lights on. But Alaska does not share a power grid with the rest of North America. And more incredibly, the vast majority of Alaska does not even share a grid with itself. If you look at the hundreds of isolated, indigenous villages scattered across the tundra, the western coast, and the Aleutian Islands, there are absolutely no transmission lines connecting them. There are no highways leading out of town. Every single one of these remote villages is completely cut off from the rest of the planet. They are sovereign, highly vulnerable energy islands because they cannot tap into a statewide grid, and because they cannot simply drill for natural gas in their own backyards. These communities must generate 100% of their own electricity and heat locally. And in an environment where temperatures routinely plunge to -40 degrees, there is only one fuel source dense enough, stable enough, and reliable enough to keep a town alive: heavy diesel fuel. Have you ever thought about what actually happens if the power plant in your city breaks down in the middle of the winter? You light a few candles, put on a sweater, and wait for the massive utility company to fix the grid. But in the Alaskan Bush, a power failure is not an inconvenience. It is an immediate, ticking countdown to catastrophe. In the center of every remote Alaskan village sits the powerhouse. It is usually an unassuming, highly reinforced metal building, but it is the absolute beating heart of the community. Inside this building are massive industrial diesel generators. These roaring machines must run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They generate the electricity that powers the medical clinic, keeps the school lights on, and runs the water treatment plant. But more importantly, the electricity powers the heavy-duty heating systems inside the individual homes. If the diesel generators fail, the town has only hours before the environment reclaims it. Without electricity, the heating systems shut down. Without heat, the interior of a home quickly drops below freezing. The water pipes freeze solid and burst, destroying the sanitary infrastructure of the house. Within a single day, an entire village can become permanently unlivable. This absolute reliance on continuous power creates a terrifying logistical demand. A single small village of 400 people can easily burn through well over 100,000 gallons of diesel fuel in a single year. When you multiply that by the roughly 200 off-grid villages scattered across the state, you are looking at tens of millions of gallons of heavy diesel fuel that must be transported into the absolute middle of nowhere. How do you deliver millions of gallons of toxic, heavy liquid to hundreds of towns that have absolutely no roads leading to them. You cannot use a pipeline because the distances are too vast and the permafrost makes underground construction impossible. You cannot simply load a fleet of tanker trucks because the wilderness is impassable. Instead, the survival of these energy islands depends entirely on one of the most extreme, terrifying, and razor-thin supply chains on the face of the Earth. The entire winter survival of rural Alaska hinges on a tiny, frantic window of time during the brief Arctic summer. For roughly 3 to 4 months a year, the massive ice sheets covering the Bering Sea and the inland rivers finally melt. This brief thaw opens up thousands of miles of natural liquid highways, and the moment the ice clears, the great diesel migration begins. Imagine being a barge captain tasked with saving a town. You are steering a massive, heavy draft river barge, loaded with hundreds of thousands of gallons of toxic diesel fuel. Your job is to navigate up the Yukon or the Kuskokwim River to deliver a village's entire annual fuel supply in a single trip. But these are not deep, predictable commercial waterways like the Mississippi River. These are wild, untamed Arctic rivers. The water levels constantly fluctuate based on glacial melt and rainfall. The riverbeds are highly unstable, filled with hidden sandbars, shifting mudflats, and massive submerged trees torn from the riverbanks. The barge captains must navigate these treacherous waters with millions of dollars of explosive fuel, knowing that if they fail, the village waiting at the end of the line will freeze in the dark. If the summer has been unusually dry, the water levels in the rivers drop drastically. The massive fuel barges literally scrape the bottom of the riverbed. In severe cases, a barge will become hopelessly stuck on a hidden sandbar, miles away from its destination. What happens to a village when the barge simply cannot make it? When the river levels drop too low, or if the region experiences an early, sudden freeze that traps the barge in solid ice before it reaches the town, the community is thrown into an absolute crisis. They must immediately pivot to the absolute last resort, flying the fuel in. Because the towns do not have roads, the only other access point is the small, gravel airstrip. The village must contract specialized aviation companies to load massive, heavy rubber bladders full of diesel fuel into the back of small cargo planes. These pilots must fly through dense Arctic fog and violent windstorms, land on a tiny dirt runway, pump a few hundred gallons of fuel into the town's tanks, and fly back to the mainland to do it all over again. This aerial lifeline is a logistical miracle, but it comes at a staggering, ruinous financial cost. Shipping a heavy liquid by air is one of the most expensive transportation methods ever devised. By the time that diesel fuel is pumped out of the airplane bladder and into the village powerhouse, the transportation fees have multiplied the baseline cost of the fuel by 3, 4, or even 5 times. The extreme geographical tax attached to this fuel creates a devastating economic reality for the people living at the end of the supply chain. They are trapped in a system where the basic cost of survival is mathematically impossible for a normal family to sustain. Let us do the brutal math of the Alaskan energy trap. In a standard American city in the lower 48 states, the average resident might pay roughly 15 cents for a single kilowatt-hour of electricity. If you leave your lights on or run your television, it is a minor expense. But in the remote Alaskan bush, because of the insane cost of barging or flying diesel fuel into the wilderness, the actual cost of generating electricity is astronomical. It is completely common for rural Alaskans to face base electricity rates of 60, 80, or even over $1 per kilowatt-hour. That is up to 6 or 7 times the national average. Now, combine that with the cost of heating oil. To keep a small, poorly insulated wooden home warm during months of negative 30-degree weather, a family might need to buy hundreds of gallons of heating fuel a month. When a single gallon of delivered diesel costs $8, $10, or $12, the monthly utility bill for a modest family home can easily explode past $1,500. How do you feed your children when your heating bill is $2,000 a month? And you live in a village with almost zero commercial economy and incredibly high unemployment. This is the very definition of energy poverty. Families are forced into a brutal, agonizing monthly choice. Do we buy groceries or do we buy heating fuel? Many families are forced to keep their homes dangerously cold, huddling in a single room with a small space heater just to conserve precious diesel. The intense financial stress destroys the local economy, as every single dollar earned in the village is immediately sucked away by the local utility cooperative just to keep the generators running. The state of Alaska knows exactly how devastating this is. To prevent a massive humanitarian crisis and the complete abandonment of rural Alaska, the state created a financial safety net called the Power Cost Equalization Program. The state takes a portion of its massive oil wealth and uses it to subsidize the electric bills of rural residents, artificially lowering the cost of power to keep it barely affordable. But this program is incredibly fragile. It relies entirely on the global price of oil. When the price of crude oil drops, the state revenues collapse, and politicians in the capital immediately threaten to cut the program. The survival of these indigenous villages is entirely at the mercy of global oil markets happening thousands of miles away. They are completely trapped by a fuel they cannot control. I asked you to stick around until the very end to understand the absolute, terrifying reality of the diesel trap. It is a concept that researchers and engineers quietly refer to as the diesel death spiral. We have established that these villages must store massive amounts of diesel fuel to survive the winter. They store this fuel in giant, industrial steel tank farms located right in the center of the town or along the riverbank. Because these are isolated Arctic villages, these massive, heavy steel tanks are built directly on top of the permafrost, the permanently frozen ground. Here is the big, heartbreaking fact. The millions of gallons of diesel fuel that these villages are forced to burn every single year produce black carbon and greenhouse gases. This local pollution, combined with the rapidly accelerating global climate change, is causing the Arctic temperatures to rise. As the temperatures rise, the permafrost directly beneath the village begins to thaw. When the permafrost melts, the ground turns into a liquid slurry. The massive, incredibly heavy steel fuel tanks begin to sink, tilt, and warp. The structural foundations fail. When the foundations fail, the rigid pipes connecting the tanks snap, or the tanks themselves rupture. This triggers catastrophic, highly toxic diesel spills directly into the local environment. Because the ground is a swampy, muddy mess, the spilled diesel flows incredibly fast, seeping straight into the local rivers. Those rivers are the exact same rivers that the indigenous people rely on to hunt salmon. Because the residents are suffering from extreme energy poverty and cannot afford to buy $50 bags of groceries flown in from the city, they rely entirely on subsistence fishing and hunting to feed their families. But the diesel spills caused by the melting permafrost poison the fishing grounds and destroy the drinking water. They are trapped in a perfect, inescapable paradox. They absolutely must burn diesel fuel to survive the freezing winter. But burning the diesel fuel accelerates the melting of the earth beneath them, which destroys their fuel tanks, poisons their food supply, and forces them to buy even more expensive imported food, deepening their poverty. This is the true, hidden cost of energy in the last frontier. The oil state that fuels the world has left its most vulnerable citizens locked in a high-stakes battle against geography, economics, and a warming planet. Until massive investments are made in advanced cold-weather renewable microgrids, like Arctic wind turbines and massive battery storage, the people of rural Alaska will remain entirely at the mercy of the diesel barge, praying the river doesn't freeze before the fuel arrives.